Welcome to Copilot Podcasts. Jesus Christ returns to earth, performs miracles, and is immediately arrested by the Catholic Church and sentenced to death as a heretic. Today, we're diving into one of literature's most provocative philosophical debates, the conversation between Ivan and Alyosha Karamazov about the Grand Inquisitor story, exploring their fundamental disagreement about human nature, freedom, and whether we're actually strong enough to handle the liberty we claim to want. By the end of this episode, you'll understand why this 19th century Russian tale still cuts to the heart of every modern debate about security versus freedom.
So let me set this up for you. We have two brothers having what might be the most intense philosophical conversation in all of literature. What's actually happening in this scene?
According to the page content, Ivan and Alyosha Karamazov meet in a tavern, and they couldn't be more different. Alyosha is described as a devout young monk, while Ivan is an intellectual atheist. And Ivan decides to tell his brother this story he's invented, what he calls a poem, about the Grand Inquisitor.
Wait, so this isn't even presented as something that actually happened? Ivan is literally making up a story to make a point?
Exactly. And that's crucial because, as the page content notes, when Alyosha asks whether this is Ivan's wild imagination or something more scandalous, Ivan just laughs and says it doesn't matter. The truth of the story isn't the point, it's the philosophical argument he's making.
That's brilliant. So what's this story Ivan tells?
The setting is Sevilla in the 16th century, during the height of the Inquisition. According to the page content, 100 heretics have just been burned at an auto da fe for the greater glory of God when Jesus Christ appears. He doesn't speak a word, but everyone recognizes him immediately.
And he starts performing miracles, right?
Yes, the page content describes how a blind old man asks to be healed so he can see Jesus, and Jesus restores his sight. Then, when a dead child is brought to the cathedral and the grieving mother begs him, Jesus brings the child back to life. The people are ecstatic, throwing flowers and shouting, "It's him."
But then everything goes wrong.
The Grand Inquisitor, described as a 90-year-old cardinal in a rough monk's robe, watches from afar and orders his guards to arrest Jesus. And here's the chilling part. The page content says the people are so submissive and obedient that they just let it happen.
So the same people who are just celebrating him as their savior immediately allow him to be arrested?
That's exactly Ivan's point about human nature. The page content explains that Jesus is taken to a dungeon in the Holy Office building, and that night the Grand Inquisitor visits him for what becomes a long monologue about why Jesus has no right to return and disturb the order the church has established for 1,000 years.
Wait, so the church's own leader is telling Jesus he's not welcome? That's incredible.
And the Inquisitor's reasoning is fascinating. According to the page content, he argues that Jesus made a fundamental error by giving humanity something they didn't want, freedom. He believes humanity is too weak to bear the burden of freedom.
Too weak for freedom? That sounds like something every authoritarian leader has ever said.
Exactly, but here's where Dostoevsky gets really sophisticated. The page content shows the Inquisitor referencing the 3 temptations Jesus faced in the desert, from Matthew 4:1-11. The Inquisitor argues that by rejecting those temptations, Jesus chose the high and free ideal over practical solutions to human suffering.
Remind me what those temptations were?
The page content references them as representing the choice between taking the power and banners of Caesar, which would have brought bread to everyone's hands, versus offering the freedom of the human spirit and free will so that they would follow you freely through faith.
So the Inquisitor is saying Jesus should have chosen to feed people and give them security instead of giving them the choice to believe or not.
That's his argument. The page content notes that the Inquisitor believes people prefer to submit to an authority that provides security and sustenance, even at the cost of their freedom. He thinks most people can't handle the burden of choice.
And this is where we get to the heart of what Ivan is really arguing with his brother about, isn't it?
Absolutely. The page content explains that this story reveals Ivan's philosophical concerns and his internal conflict about God's existence and the nature of evil. He's essentially asking, is freedom really a gift, or is it a burden that only a few can bear?
That's such a modern question. I mean, how many people today choose convenience and security over the messiness of real freedom?
And that's why this 1880 story still resonates. The page content notes that Dostoevsky was writing during a period of political and social upheaval in Russia, with the abolition of serfdom and growing industrialization creating massive inequality. These weren't abstract philosophical questions.
So what does Jesus do in response to this whole accusation? Does he defend himself?
This is the most powerful part. Jesus remains completely silent throughout the Inquisitor's entire monologue. He doesn't argue, doesn't defend himself, doesn't even speak.
That silence is almost more powerful than any argument he could make.
And then, according to the page content, Jesus responds with a single action. He kisses the old Inquisitor. That's it. Just a kiss, and then the Inquisitor opens the cell door and tells him to go and never come back.
A kiss? After everything the Inquisitor just said about him being wrong and dangerous?
The page content suggests this kiss represents that, despite doubts and suffering, love and freedom are the supreme values that transcend any temporal power or ideology. It's Jesus choosing love over argument, freedom over control.
But here's what I find fascinating. Ivan is telling this story to his devoutly religious brother. What's Alyosha's reaction?
The page content shows that Alyosha questions whether this is Ivan's wild imagination or something more scandalous. He's clearly troubled by the implications of the story, especially coming from his atheist brother.
Because if Ivan is right about human nature being too weak for freedom, what does that say about faith itself?
Exactly. The page content notes that this story is central to understanding the novel's debate about the conflict between free will and security, between faith and doubt, and between divine love and earthly power. Ivan is essentially challenging everything Alyosha believes.
And what makes this even more complex is that Ivan isn't necessarily wrong about how people behave, is he?
That's the brilliance of Dostoevsky's writing. The page content explains that through this dialogue, Dostoevsky not only criticizes religious institutions that seek to control humanity, but also poses deep questions about the nature of good, evil, and human capacity to live in freedom.
So he's not just critiquing the church, he's questioning whether any of us are really equipped for the freedom we say we want.
And this connects to the broader context of the novel. The page content describes Los Hermanos Karamazov as a philosophical and psychological novel set in 19th century Russia that deeply explores ethical debates about God, free will, and morality.
You know what strikes me? The Inquisitor isn't presented as evil exactly. He genuinely believes he's protecting people from something they can't handle.
That's what makes this so unsettling. The page content describes the Inquisitor as astute and calculating, capable of manipulating the masses to maintain his power and control, but his motivation seems to be a kind of paternalistic care for humanity's weakness.
Which is terrifying because it means the road to authoritarianism can be paved with genuine concern for people's well-being.
And that brings us back to why this conversation between Ivan and Alyosha is so crucial. The page content notes that Ivan is described as an intellectual deeply tormented by doubt and skepticism who uses this story to illustrate his critique of God and the church.
But Alyosha represents the opposite perspective: faith, devotion, the belief that people can handle freedom if they're guided by love.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that the page content shows how this story became famous beyond Dostoevsky's original work. The Russian writer Vasily Rozanov made it famous with an article called The Legend of the Grand Inquisitor, published in 1894.
So this philosophical debate has been resonating with people for over a century. Why do you think that is?
Because the fundamental question hasn't changed. The page content notes that Dostoevsky explores one of the most important philosophical questions. Is freedom really a gift, or is it a burden that only a few can bear? That's as relevant today as it was in 1880.
And we see this tension everywhere. People demanding freedom but then choosing convenience, security, someone else to make the hard choices.
The page content emphasizes that this story is part of the novel's broader exploration of spiritual drama of moral struggles related to faith, doubt, judgment, and reason. It's not just about religion, it's about how we live as human beings.
But here's what I keep coming back to, Jesus' response. He doesn't argue with the Inquisitor's logic. He just kisses him and walks away.
And the page content suggests that kiss represents the idea that love and freedom are the supreme values that transcend any temporal power or ideology. It's not about winning the argument, it's about embodying a different way of being.
Which brings us to what this means for Ivan and Alyosha's relationship. They're not just debating philosophy, they're trying to understand how to live.
The page content shows that this conversation reveals Ivan's philosophical concerns and his internal conflict regarding God's existence and the nature of evil. He's not just being intellectual, he's struggling with fundamental questions about meaning and morality.
And Alyosha, as the devout brother, has to grapple with the possibility that his faith might be naive, that people really might prefer security to freedom.
Which is why the page content describes this as one of the most profound and philosophically charged moments in the novel. It's not just a story within a story, it's the heart of everything Dostoevsky was trying to explore about human nature.
You know what's remarkable? We're talking about a conversation between two fictional brothers in a 19th century Russian novel, but it feels like they could be having this exact debate today.
Because the questions are eternal. The page content notes that the novel was written during a period of political and social upheaval in Russia, with massive social changes. But every generation faces the same choice between freedom and security, between the difficulty of choice and the comfort of being told what to do.
And maybe that's why this story has endured. It's not giving us easy answers, it's forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves.
The page content emphasizes that Dostoevsky poses deep questions about the nature of good, evil, and human capacity to live in freedom. He's not telling us what to think, he's showing us the complexity of the choice itself.
So, when you step back from all this, what's the real significance of this conversation between Ivan and Alyosha? What are they really fighting about?
They're fighting about the fundamental nature of humanity. Ivan believes we're too weak for real freedom and that institutions like the church, despite their flaws, provide necessary structure. Alyosha believes in human capacity for love and moral choice, even when it's difficult.
And neither of them is completely wrong, which is what makes this so powerful. The Inquisitor's concerns about human weakness aren't unfounded, but Jesus' response suggests there's something more important than just managing that weakness.
Exactly. The page content shows that this story explores whether freedom is really a gift or a burden that only a few can bear. But maybe the answer isn't either or. Maybe it's both, and that's precisely why it matters.
Because if freedom is easy, it's not really freedom. And if it's impossible, then we're not really human.
And that tension between our capacity for freedom and our desire for security, that's what makes us human. Dostoevsky isn't resolving that tension, he's showing us how to live with it honestly.
Which brings us back to that kiss. Jesus doesn't solve the Inquisitor's dilemma, but he offers something else. Love that doesn't require control. Freedom that doesn't abandon responsibility.
And maybe that's what Ivan is really offering Alyosha. Not a solution, but a deeper understanding of what they're both struggling with. The page content suggests this conversation reveals the complexity of faith, doubt, and human moral capacity.
So the next time you find yourself choosing between convenience and principle, between security and freedom, remember these two brothers in a Russian tavern, wrestling with the same questions that define what it means to be human. The Grand Inquisitor's dilemma isn't just a literary device, it's the choice we make every day about who we want to be and how much freedom we can actually handle.
And remember that sometimes the most profound response isn't an argument, it's a kiss, a gesture of love that transcends the need to be right. That's the gift Dostoevsky gives us through Ivan and Alyosha's conversation.
Thanks for joining us on Copilot Podcasts. The next time someone offers you security in exchange for freedom, you'll know you're not just facing a political choice, you're confronting the eternal human question that even Jesus couldn't answer with words.